Don't, please stop. She clutched her belly, voice trembling, as cold, sullied water cascaded down the front of her dress. It soaked her shirt, soaked her skin, dripped to the floor. Someone gasped behind her, glass shattered, phones raised. Laughter erupted from a distant table. "Next time, pay before you sit," the waitress snapped, lips curling in satisfaction. In that moment, the entire cafe froze. The pregnant stranger stood drenched, humiliated, yet unbowed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Would you have stood your ground or walked away? Rewind 2 days earlier. The woman's name was Grace Mitchell, 32 years old and 7 months pregnant. Grace wasn't the kind of woman who demanded attention. She carried herself with quiet dignity, the sort of calm that made people instinctively lower their voices when she walked into a room. After years abroad, she had returned to her hometown of Crestwood, an old, close-knit community where everyone knew everyone, to reclaim the one thing that still connected her to her late father, Evelyn's Bistro. The place had been his pride, his life's work, and after his passing, it had changed hands several times. Grace wanted to see what had become of it before relaunching under its original values. She decided to visit unannounced, dressed simply in jeans, a faded sweater, and her late father's silver bracelet, a small reminder of the love and integrity that once filled the restaurant's walls. Grace pushed the door open that afternoon and was greeted by the faint aroma of coffee and grilled cheese. Laughter floated from the corner booths, sunlight spilled through dusty blinds, and soft jazz hummed in the background. To anyone else, it looked like an ordinary lunch hour, but to Grace it felt different, duller somehow. The warmth that used to define Evelyn's Bistro had been replaced by something colder. She stepped quietly toward a table near the window, gently resting a hand on her belly as she sat down. The hostess gave a half-hearted smile but didn't bring a menu. 5 minutes passed, then 10. No one came over. Grace didn't complain. She believed patience revealed more about people than confrontation ever could. Behind the counter stood Tanya Rhodes, a 28-year-old waitress whose reputation among co-workers was well known. Tanya was sharp-tongued, confident to a fault, and often said that nice people never get tips. She had worked at the bistro for 6 months, long enough to grow cynical about customers she thought beneath her. "The polite ones always order cheap," she would say with a smirk. That day, Tanya's irritation had reached its limit. Her rent was due, her car had broken down, and the manager had gone home early, leaving her in charge. When she saw Grace sitting quietly by the window, wearing a plain grey sweater and no jewelry, Tanya sighed. "Probably another charity case," she muttered under her breath to her co-worker, Lila, who pretended not to hear. Grace's soft voice broke the momentary silence. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said kindly. "May I please have a glass of water while I wait?" Tanya didn't look up from wiping the counter. "Sure," she replied flatly, her tone dripping with irritation. Instead of fetching it, she continued scrolling through her phone. Grace smiled faintly, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to react. She didn't want to cause trouble. She only wanted to observe. 10 minutes later, Tanya finally grabbed a glass. She filled it half full from the sink behind the counter, glanced at it, then rolled her eyes. "That'll do," she said to herself. She walked over, her heels clicking sharply on the tile floor. Without making eye contact, she dropped the glass on the table so hard that some of the water splashed over the edge. "There," she said curtly, and walked away. Grace thanked her anyway. "Thank you kindly," she whispered, adjusting her seat. As the minutes ticked by, the small slights began to pile up. Tanya ignored her when she tried to order, choosing instead to serve 2 couples who had arrived after her. When Grace smiled and tried again, Tanya laughed. "Sweetheart, maybe you should go somewhere else if you can't afford lunch." The words stung, but Grace kept her composure. She wasn't there to defend herself. She was there to learn how people were treated when no one thought they mattered. The other employees noticed but stayed silent. Lila bit her lip as she cleared a nearby table. The busboy whispered, She's pregnant. But Tanya didn't care. Pregnant or not, Tanya said under her breath. You don't come into a place like this if you can't handle a little attitude. Grace folded her napkin carefully and placed it on the table. She had been raised to treat everyone with grace, no matter how unkind they were. Her father used to tell her, kindness doesn't make you weak, Grace. It reveals strength in a world that often forgets how to care. That thought steadied her. Still, deep inside, she couldn't deny the ache, the humiliation of being judged for looking ordinary. Outside, the weather began to change. Clouds gathered, rain pattered softly against the windows. Inside, the atmosphere thickened. The murmur of other diners grew quieter as they began to sense tension. Tanya, still irritated, leaned over to Lila and whispered, "Watch this." She picked up a jug from the sink filled with leftover dishwater and grease. Grace didn't notice at first. She was staring at her reflection in the window, lost in thought, unaware that this moment would become the turning point of her entire life. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. As the rain outside intensified, so did the storm building quietly within the walls of Evelyn's bistro. What happened next would expose the hidden cruelty behind a simple act of service and reveal that the woman sitting quietly by the window wasn't just another customer. She was the one person in that room who held every future paycheck, every lease, every decision in her hands, and none of them, least of all Tanya Rhodes, had any idea who Grace Mitchell truly was. By mid-afternoon, Evelyn's bistro had begun to fill with its usual crowd. The lunchtime chatter returned, the clinking of silverware, the hum of quiet conversation, and the soft sound of rain tapping against the windows. The smell of grilled sandwiches and roasted coffee filled the air. In the middle of it all sat Grace Mitchell, her hands gently folded over her round belly, still waiting patiently for a meal that would never come. Every few minutes, Tanya Rhodes' voice echoed from across the counter, snapping orders, laughing loudly, or gossiping with Lila, the younger waitress who tried her best to stay out of trouble. Grace watched, her eyes calm, her demeanor unshaken, even as she noticed customers who came in after her being served and thanked with warm smiles. She quietly adjusted her sweater and waited, hoping Tanya might remember her table. But Tanya never did. Grace finally raised her voice slightly, just enough to be heard. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I've been waiting a while. Is it possible to take my order now?" Tanya turned from the counter, her expression instantly sour. "You think I've got nothing else to do but wait on people who can't even afford a meal?" she said loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear. The room fell into a brief silence. Grace's lips parted in shock. "I didn't mean," she began, but Tanya cut her off sharply. "Yeah, sure you didn't," she hissed, her tone dripping with contempt as she tossed the laminated menu onto the floor. The sound of the menu hitting the tiles echoed across the small restaurant. A few heads turned. Grace hesitated, then slowly leaned down to pick it up. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it, her belly pressing against the edge of the table. The customers who noticed the exchange shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, others stared. A man at the counter shook his head. "That's not right," he murmured, but no one intervened. Grace's face flushed with quiet embarrassment. She didn't cry. She didn't defend herself. She only whispered, "I'm sorry if I caused trouble." Tanya smirked. "Apology doesn't get you service, sweetheart," she said mockingly, and turned away. Grace's throat tightened. Her father had once told her that cruelty always reveals itself when people believe no one's watching. She wondered if he'd been right all along. She sat there in silence for several minutes, trying to collect herself, trying not to draw attention. At the counter, Tanya's irritation grew. "Unbelievable," she muttered to Lila. "She's just sitting there like I owe her the world." Lila looked uneasy. "Maybe she's having a hard day," she said quietly. Tanya scoffed. "We're all having hard days. Doesn't mean we get to sit around acting entitled." Her words were sharp, her voice rising with every sentence. She glanced at Grace's table again, noticing how calm she still appeared, how undeservedly graceful she was, despite the humiliation. And for reasons Tanya couldn't explain, that calmness made her angrier. 5 more minutes passed. Then Tanya picked up a glass from the bus station, still streaked with soap residue. She filled it halfway with murky grey water from the dish bin, the same one used to soak utensils, and began walking toward Grace's table. Lila's eyes widened. "Tanya, don't," she whispered, but Tanya ignored her. She plastered on a smile that looked more like a sneer and set the glass down in front of Grace. The water inside was cloudy, a film of grease floating on top. "There," Tanya said. "You wanted water, right?" Her voice dripped with false sweetness. A few customers exchanged looks. Grace's eyes glistened as she stared at the glass. She didn't speak. She simply pressed her hand against her stomach and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice was so gentle, it made the moment even more painful to witness. Tanya crossed her arms and tilted her head. "Oh, come on. You can't even take a joke," she said, loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. Laughter erupted from a corner table, 2 teenage boys smirking into their phones. Grace blinked back tears. She didn't want to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. Then, without warning, Tanya grabbed the jug from her tray, the same one she had used to rinse dishes, and in one fluid motion poured it over Grace's chest and shoulders. The brownish water splashed down her dress, drenching her completely. The cafe went silent. A fork clattered to the floor. For a moment, even the music stopped. All that could be heard was the dripping sound of dirty water hitting the tiles beneath Grace's feet. A man at the counter stood up. "She's pregnant, for God's sake," he shouted, his voice trembling with disbelief, but Tanya only shrugged. "She shouldn't be out begging then," she replied, her tone cold, unremorseful. "If you can't handle restaurant prices, don't walk in." Grace rose slowly, her hands shaking but her back straight. Water trickled down her arms, soaking her sleeves, her hair plastered against her face. She looked at Tanya, really looked at her, and for the first time, Tanya seemed unsettled. There was no anger in Grace's eyes, only something deeper, something calm and knowing, as though she had already decided what would happen next. Without a word, Grace picked up her bag, brushed her wet dress lightly and walked toward the door. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint squeak of her wet shoes against the floor. When the door closed behind her, the entire cafe exhaled in a wave of discomfort. Leela turned to Tanya. "Why would you do that?" she asked softly. Tanya rolled her eyes. "Because I can," she said flatly, tossing the jug back into the sink. "And guess what? Tomorrow I'll still have my job." But what Tanya Rhodes didn't realize in that moment was that her job, her reputation, and everything she took pride in had already begun to crumble. The woman she had humiliated wasn't just another stranger. She was Grace Mitchell, the rightful owner of Evelyn's Bistro, the daughter of the man whose name still hung above the door, and the woman whose quiet grace would soon turn Tanya's arrogance into her own undoing. And if you were in that room, watching this unfold, what would you have done? Would you have stepped in or sat in silence like everyone else that day? 2 days passed. The air around Evelyn's Bistro felt heavier than usual, thick with rumors and tension. The staff had received a short, formal message that morning pinned to the staff notice board. Mandatory staff meeting at 10 a.m. Attendance required. New ownership announcement. No one knew what it meant. Whispers floated through the kitchen. Some said the restaurant was being sold again. Others feared layoffs. But no one, not even Tanya Rhodes, suspected the truth. Tanya arrived late, as usual, wearing her uniform slightly wrinkled and her hair hastily tied back. She walked in chewing gum, confident and dismissive. "I bet they're just changing management again," she said to Lila, who was nervously twisting a towel in her hands. "Whoever it is, they'll still need waitresses, and we both know I'm the best one here." Her laugh was brittle, the kind that hides insecurity beneath arrogance. But deep down, she felt something off, a strange unease she couldn't explain. The employees gathered near the counter, a circle of tension and curiosity. The rain that had started the day of the incident had returned, tapping softly on the windows like a reminder of what had been done. Tanya leaned against the counter, rolling her eyes at the thought of another boss with big dreams and no clue how to run a place. Then, at exactly 10 o'clock, the sound of heels echoed from the hallway. The door opened slowly and in walked Grace Mitchell. She was unrecognizable from the drenched, humiliated woman Tanya had poured dirty water on. Her posture was strong, her hair neatly pinned, and she wore a fitted navy blue suit that exuded quiet authority. A subtle gold wedding band caught the light as she closed the door behind her. The room fell completely silent. Tanya's chewing stopped mid-bite. The gum nearly fell from her mouth. Her body went still, her face draining of color as recognition crept in. It was her, the same woman she had mocked, insulted, and humiliated just 2 days before. "Good morning," Grace began, her voice calm, steady, and composed. "I'm Grace Mitchell, the new owner of Evelyn's Bistro." The words landed like thunder in the room. A wave of disbelief rippled across every face. Lila gasped softly. The busboy dropped the tray he had been holding, plates clattering to the floor. The cook, Mr. Jenkins, muttered, "You've got to be kidding." But it wasn't a joke. Grace stepped forward, her heels clicking rhythmically on the floor as she looked around the room, at the very people who had watched her humiliation and said nothing. "I recognize all of you," she said quietly. Her tone wasn't angry, but there was a gravity in her voice that made everyone uneasy. I remember who laughed. I remember who looked away. And I especially remember the one who believed kindness was optional. Her gaze settled on Tanya Rhodes. Tanya's breath quickened. She tried to smile, tried to speak, but no words came. Grace didn't blink. She took a slow step closer. 2 days ago, Grace said, I walked into this very restaurant as a customer. I sat quietly. I waited patiently. I asked politely, and I was treated like a burden. But you, she paused, her eyes narrowing, you did something unforgettable. You poured dirty water on me when I was a customer. Let's see how you handle clean consequences. The room went still. You could almost hear Tanya's heartbeat. Lila covered her mouth with her hand, whispering, "Oh my God," under her breath. Mr. Jenkins stared at the floor, ashamed. Tanya finally stammered, I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know who you were." Grace tilted her head slightly, her voice still calm. "And that," she said, "is exactly the point. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with decency." The staff exchanged nervous glances. Grace turned to the rest of them. "I don't believe in shouting or public humiliation, but I do believe in accountability. From today forward, this restaurant will run differently. Those who value compassion and integrity will stay. Those who think arrogance is customer service will not." Her gaze returned to Tanya, whose legs trembled slightly as she tried to hold her composure. Grace didn't raise her voice, didn't insult her. She simply said, "Tanya Rhodes, you're dismissed, effective immediately." Tanya's eyes widened. "You can't just—" "I can," Grace replied softly, "and I just did." For a moment, Tanya stood frozen, speechless, as the reality of it settled in. Grace handed a neatly folded letter to her. "That's your termination notice. You'll receive your final paycheck once we've reviewed the damage report from that afternoon. I suggest you use the time to reflect." Tanya's pride faltered. She wanted to argue, but no words came. The arrogance that once filled her voice was gone, replaced by silent panic. She turned toward the others, but no one met her eyes. Grace looked around the room once more. "Let this be clear," she said. "Evelyn's Bistro was built on respect. Respect for food, for service, and for people. My father believed that kindness is the strongest form of leadership. I intend to restore that belief, no matter what it takes." She placed her hands on the counter, her tone softening just slightly. "For those who are willing to grow, this is your chance. For those who aren't, today is your last day." No one dared to move. Tanya's hands shook as she picked up her apron and stuffed it into her bag. Her lips parted, but the words never came. She pushed open the door and stepped out into the rain, her pride dissolving with every drop that hit her face. Grace watched her leave, her expression unreadable. Then she turned back to the remaining staff. "Let's start over," she said quietly. "This place deserves better. So do the people who walk through that door." Grace Mitchell never raised her voice, never resorted to cruelty, and never once sought validation from those who had witnessed her humiliation. She simply acted with the calm precision of someone who understood that true power doesn't come from revenge. It comes from restoration. In the days following that fateful staff meeting, the town of Crestwood began to buzz. Rumors spread like wildfire through coffee shops, local Facebook pages, and small-town gossip circles. Everyone was talking about the pregnant woman who had returned to reclaim her late father's restaurant, and the waitress who had poured dirty water on her without realizing who she was. Tanya Rhodes's termination became the talk of the town. Grace had handled it quietly but firmly. Her letter of dismissal was signed, sealed, and filed within the hour. The document cited harassment, misconduct, and violation of workplace ethics. Tanya's final paycheck was placed on hold pending an internal review. When she left that morning, her once confident stride had been replaced by an uncertain shuffle. Her co-workers avoided eye contact. Even those who had laughed with her 2 days earlier couldn't look at her the same way. By evening, the story had already leaked. Someone from the staff anonymously posted about it online, describing what had happened that day, with just enough detail to spark outrage. Waitress pours dirty water on pregnant woman. Turns out she's the owner. Within hours, the story spread across local groups and Twitter threads. Comments flooded in. "Serves her right." "I used to eat there. Can't believe that happened." "She deserves to lose her job." By the next morning, Tanya's phone wouldn't stop buzzing, not from friends offering support, but from notifications she wished she could escape. Her name had become synonymous with humiliation. Restaurants across town began quietly removing her application from their lists. One diner manager even said, "We can't afford to have someone like her." She tried to defend herself online, posting a message that read, "People are exaggerating, it wasn't even that bad." But the replies were merciless. Screenshots of her smirking during the incident circulated. A short video clip, captured by a bystander that day, began to make rounds. It showed the moment the water splashed over Grace's dress, the way Grace stood silently, drenched but dignified. The video's caption read, "Grace under pressure," literally. Grace had no intention of destroying Tanya's life, but she believed the community deserved to understand what had gone wrong. She asked the restaurant's lawyer to release a formal statement to the Crestwood Daily Post. Evelyn's Bistro upholds respect, compassion, and professionalism. No employee should ever humiliate another human being regardless of status. The restaurant's new management will ensure that kindness, not arrogance, defines our service. The story went viral beyond Crestwood. Regional news stations picked it up. "Pregnant woman humiliated by waitress, turns out she's the owner," appeared on countless feeds and local TV crawlers. Customers began lining up outside the bistro, not to mock the incident, but to show support for Grace. Many brought flowers, letters, and even handwritten notes that read, "We stand with you." Grace didn't bask in the attention. When reporters asked her for comment, she said, "This isn't about me, it's about reminding people that respect is free, yet so often withheld from those who appear ordinary." Her words struck a chord. People began sharing their own experiences of being mistreated by service workers, employers, or strangers. Evelyn's Bistro, once a quiet little eatery, had become a symbol of empathy restored. Tanya, meanwhile, couldn't leave her house without feeling eyes on her. A local blogger wrote an article titled, "The Cost of Cruelty, When a Moment of Pride Becomes a Lifetime of Regret." Every word cut deeper than any reprimand could. For the first time, Tanya felt what it meant to be publicly shamed, not by a superior, but by the very community she had once sneered at. Grace didn't stop at social accountability. She believed in structure, in fairness. 2 days later, she filed a formal complaint with the local labor board and police department for workplace harassment and disorderly conduct. She wasn't seeking revenge, just justice. The footage from the restaurant's security cameras provided irrefutable evidence. Tanya pouring the dirty water, Grace standing there soaked and silent, the shock on the customers' faces. When Tanya received the notice, she broke down in her small apartment. She couldn't afford a lawyer, and her savings had already begun to dwindle. The fine wasn't enormous, but the weight of it, combined with her eviction notice, felt unbearable. She tried calling her boyfriend, Eli, but he didn't answer. When she finally reached him days later, he told her flatly, "I can't do this anymore, Tanya. You humiliated a pregnant woman. I can't even look at you the same way." Then the line went dead. The eviction came soon after. Her landlord, who had once tolerated her late payments, handed her a notice. "Bad publicity isn't good for the building," he said coldly. Tanya pleaded, promised to make up for it, but he had already made up his mind. Within a week, she was packing what little she had into a single duffel bag. It wasn't just her job, her apartment, or her relationship that Tanya lost. It was the illusion of control she had built her identity on. She used to believe that belittling others made her stronger, that her sarcasm gave her power. But now, every face she passed on the street reminded her of what she'd done. Even strangers recognized her from the viral clip. A mother at the grocery store whispered, "That's her." A teenager snickered. Tanya began avoiding crowded places altogether. For the first time in her life, Tanya felt the same isolation she once inflicted on others, the same cold silence Grace had felt as the restaurant watched her humiliation in silence. She spent nights staring at the ceiling, hearing Grace's calm voice in her mind, "Let's see how you handle clean consequences." Grace, meanwhile, quietly transformed Evelyn's bistro into something greater than a business. She repainted the walls, replaced the dim lights with warm fixtures, and added a sign by the entrance that read, "Every guest deserves grace." Once a week, she introduced Monday Meals for Mothers, a community program that offered free lunches for single mothers and expectant women. Word spread quickly. Families came not just for the food, but for the compassion they felt inside the walls. Under Grace's leadership, the restaurant flourished again. Reviews poured in online, not just praising the food, but the kindness of the staff. "You can feel the warmth in this place," one customer wrote. "It's like eating inside someone's home." Grace often stayed late, long after the doors had closed, cleaning tables and writing notes for her team. She never mentioned Tanya again, never gloated about the outcome. Her belief was simple. When you rebuild with kindness, the echo of cruelty eventually fades on its own. And yet, somewhere in the quiet outskirts of Crestwood, Tanya Rhodes was still trying to make sense of the world she had torn apart with her own hands. Her arrogance was gone. All that remained was the hollow understanding that what she had done in one careless moment had cost her everything. So if you were Grace Mitchell standing in her place, would you have forgiven Tanya, or would you have done the same? Would you have walked away or made sure she learned the lesson that only consequences can teach? Months passed, and time began to heal what humiliation had once scarred. Evelyn's bistro, under Grace Mitchell's quiet yet steady leadership, transformed into something far more than just a restaurant. It became a refuge. What had started as an act of pain turned into a movement of kindness that rippled far beyond the four walls where it all began. Customers who once came just for a sandwich or cup of coffee now came for the feeling, the warmth, the welcome, the understanding that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity. Grace, now glowing with the calm strength of motherhood, had given birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Evan, after her late father, the man whose heart had built Evelyn's bistro from the ground up. Every time she looked into her son's eyes, she saw the same patience, the same wisdom her father carried. It reminded her why she'd chosen compassion over revenge. Her father had always said, "Grace, when you lead with kindness, even your enemies will learn from your silence." Those words echoed through her as she rebuilt not just a business, but a legacy. The restaurant flourished. Review after review praised the new spirit of compassion. Families gathered at the tables, laughter returned to the walls. Customers began sharing stories of their own struggles, and Grace listened, never judging, always understanding. Every Monday, the Meals for Mothers program filled the cafe with gratitude. Women who had faced hardship found hope there. Many said Grace had given them more than food. She had given them dignity. On a quiet afternoon, Grace sat in the same corner where everything had once gone wrong. The soft hum of conversation filled the air, and sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the polished wooden tables. She sipped her tea slowly, her eyes drifting toward her employees, each one smiling, each one kind. Lila, now the head waitress, moved gracefully between tables, her voice gentle as she served customers. There was harmony now, a living reminder of what Evelyn's bistro had become under Grace's care. From where she sat, Grace could see the reflection of her old self in that window, the woman who had once stood drenched, humiliated, and silent. She smiled faintly, realizing that pain had been the seed that birthed something beautiful. That day had changed her life, yes, but it had also changed an entire community's view of what leadership meant. Meanwhile, Tanya Rhodes's life had taken a very different path. After her dismissal, her reputation in Crestwood never recovered. Every restaurant she applied to turned her away. The viral clip followed her everywhere she went, whispered about, laughed at, pitied. Eventually, she left town, taking a low-paying job at a roadside diner along Highway 9. The uniform there was faded, the neon sign buzzed faintly at night, and tips were scarce. But what weighed heaviest wasn't the loss of luxury. It was the silence. Tanya had once been loud, confident, full of words that cut others down. Now she barely spoke. She kept her head down, cleaning tables long after closing time. Customers sometimes recognized her. A few would whisper, "That's her, the one from the video." Others would stare, then turn away. No one needed to remind her of what she had done. The shame was permanent, living quietly inside her like a shadow she couldn't escape. Sometimes she thought about Grace Mitchell. She remembered the look in Grace's eyes that day, not anger, not even contempt, but something that haunted her even more: disappointment. For the first time in her life, Tanya understood what it meant to be truly seen for who she was. And in that realization, she found a painful kind of humility. Back in town, Grace rarely spoke of Tanya. When asked about her in interviews or conversations, she would only smile gently and say, "Some lessons come with stains that don't wash off." She meant it not with cruelty but with truth. Some mistakes can't be undone, only learned from. One evening, as the restaurant lights dimmed and Evan slept in her arms, Grace walked to the door of Evelyn's bistro and turned the open sign to closed. She looked around one last time before locking up. The smell of baked bread lingered in the air, mingling with the faint notes of jazz playing softly in the background. The same place that had once witnessed her humiliation now stood as a monument to dignity, strength, and second chances. Grace whispered quietly to herself, "Dad, we did it." She stepped outside, looking up at the newly restored sign above the door, Evelyn's Bistro, where every guest deserves grace. The night air was cool, the streets calm, and in that silence, Grace felt peace. She had reclaimed not just her restaurant, but her sense of worth. Across town, Tanya finished wiping the last counter of the night. The neon sign outside flickered, and she stared at her reflection in the window, the same reflection Grace once stared through in silence. She sighed deeply and whispered, "I'm sorry." No one heard her. But for the first time, she meant it. Back at Evelyn's bistro, Grace placed her sleeping son in his crib, kissed his forehead, and sat by the window where moonlight spilled across the room. She thought about how far she'd come, from humiliation to healing, from pain to purpose. She closed her eyes and smiled, whispering softly, almost like a prayer. In the end, arrogance crumbles, but dignity survives.